I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space. And none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I'm John Charles. I recently retired from NASA after almost 33 years in the space life sciences, which gave me a perspective on not only the life sciences themselves, but on how they interact with other aspects of space exploration. I'm going to talk to you today about living and working on the moon. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the first Apollo moon landing, and that reminded us of the excitement and the drama and the gratification of the Apollo program. The excitement of the launch and the activity on the lunar surface, and then the relief when the capsule splashed down the Pacific Ocean. But there was more than just the excitement and drama to be dealt with. There were biomedical results acquired from Apollo. They are captured nicely in a NASA publication called Biomedical Results of Apollo. I'll be using that for most of the historical information I provide today. The Apollo program collected data on astronauts before flight, during flight, and after flight. Before flight, the measurements were for crew health protection, making sure that there were no infectious diseases transmitted to the astronauts that might flare up during the mission. And you recall, no doubt, the Apollo 13 episode with one astronaut being grounded because he was exposed to German measles. Even earlier in the program, an entire flight was delayed by several days as the astronauts recuperated from head colds. There were also in-flight measurements of a fairly routine and minimal nature, mostly involving radiation measurements during the flight to make sure the astronauts did not exceed any established limits and to document the environment they were going through. And during spacewalks or moonwalks, called EVAs, studying the metabolic loads generated by the astronauts and heat dissipation by the astronauts inside of their pressure suits. There were also a set of pre- and post-flight medical testing measurements that were acquired that looked at the endocrine system, especially the electrolytes and the body fluid volume changes that occurred in spaceflight, the clinical parameters, clinical biochemistry, specific studies of red blood cells and immunology, cardiovascular function, how the astronauts' cardiovascular systems responded to gravity loads after periods in weightlessness and after periods at 1/6 of Earth's gravity, and crew vestibular responses relating to a new phenomenon of space motion sickness observed for the first time in Apollo. During this presentation, I'll be reviewing the state of biomedical knowledge before, during, and after Apollo that's relevant to lunar surface exploration. So we'll cover what we knew going into Apollo, what we learned during Apollo, what we've learned since then, and what might we still learn to benefit future exploration missions. First, from the perspective of the life sciences in spaceflight, we need to briefly address the hazards of deep space missions. These hazards are the guiding architecture for NASA's human research program. These hazards help to collect and sort the risks that have been identified for deep space exploration missions, and I'm borrowing them here for this discussion. The hazards of deep space include altered gravity, that is the weightlessness of ballistic spaceflight, as well as the hypergravity of launch and landing, and the reduced gravity of planetary surface activities, the space radiation environment, the hostile and enclosed environment, the isolation and confinement of spaceflight, and finally the distance from Earth. And I'll discuss each of those in sequence. This is not to minimize the more well-known hazards of any space mission, including the launch, during which stored chemical energy is converted into kinetic energy and potential energy to take the space vehicle, whatever it is, from a standing start into an orbit around the Earth as an initial state at least, moving 5 miles a second at about 100 miles or so altitude, usually within the space of 8 to 10 minutes. And then at the end of the mission, converting the potential and kinetic energy into thermal energy so it can be dissipated safely and the astronauts or the payloads can safely return to the surface of the Earth. I acknowledge that those are substantial risks, and in fact, all of the fatalities that have occurred in spaceflight have occurred during launch and during landing. So those are not the problems that I'm going to be addressing, though, from the life sciences perspective. The results I'm going to talk about are from the early space age. And just as a brief reminder, the early space age in the U.S. started with Project Mercury, the one-man vehicle, which segued into Gemini, the two-man vehicle, as preparation for the Apollo program's three-man spacecraft in two parts: the command and service module, which orbited the moon and returned the astronauts to the Earth, and the lunar module, which deposited two of the three astronauts safely on the moon and returned them back into lunar orbit. Gemini produced several significant biomedical findings in terms of all of the body systems. Demonstrated the development of orthostatic intolerance, that is, lightheadedness on standing after spaceflight. Demonstrated the development of decreased exercise capacity. Demonstrated that there were red blood cell changes, there were minimal bone changes, some loss of muscle tissue, but no vestibular symptoms were observed in the Gemini program. Apollo confirmed all of those and provided some additional insight from larger crew sizes and more participants. Apollo also demonstrated the first evidence of vestibular symptoms that we now call space motion sickness in 2 out of the 33 crew members that flew on Apollo. Also the development of cardiac arrhythmias, that is, changes in cardiac rhythm in 2 astronauts on a single Apollo lunar landing mission. That indicated there may be cardiac rhythm problems in future more ambitious and more metabolically taxing space flights. Also showed increased loss of muscle and so forth. Apollo also demonstrated the ability to execute very challenging extravehicular activities using a technology that was not available in Gemini. Gemini used air-cooled spacesuits, which most of the astronauts on Gemini EVAs quickly overwhelmed given the scope of the tasks they were trying to accomplish outside of their spacecraft. Apollo provided water-cooled, liquid-cooled suits, which proved to be very effective in countering the increased heat loads of astronauts doing very challenging activities on the lunar surface during especially the subsequent Apollo missions. And at no time was any astronaut challenged by heat stress or excessive heat load. So that was a victory for Apollo and a technology that is still used today, not only in spacewalking, but in high thermal load environments like race car driving and first responders and fires and so forth. So among the hazards I'm going to describe to you, the first one I'm going to discuss with you is altered gravity. Any rocket launch is going to involve an acceleration from the surface of the Earth. In Apollo, those launches generated G levels of up to 4 or 5 Gs at phases during the powered flight, which then almost immediately became zero gravity once the astronauts were in low Earth orbit in ballistic unpowered spaceflight. The G levels increased slightly then to about 1 G during powered translunar insertion, that is, departing low Earth orbit for the moon. During the 3-day coast to the moon, the G levels were again zero gravity. During the powered orbit insertion around the moon, there was an increase in G to just under 1 G. When the astronauts descended to the surface of the moon, they gradually experienced a small fraction of Earth's gravity, culminating in about 1/6 of a G as they were hovering above the surface. Then, of course, their time on the surface was all at 1/6 of Earth's gravity, which is the moon's normal gravity level. Blasting off from the moon gave them a G load approaching 1 G just for the few minutes that the rocket was firing. And again, during ballistic flight, they were at zero gravity. The Apollo spacecraft, when it departed lunar orbit, again achieved approaching 1 G acceleration for the few minutes of propulsion. It coasted for 3 days at 0 G. And then during the ultimate dynamic event of the mission, the entry into Earth's atmosphere, G loads were up to 7 Gs for a period of a few minutes as the spacecraft decelerated and then descended to the ocean for its splashdown. So those are the altered G environments of Apollo. They are typical of the altered gravity environments that astronauts will experience on future moon missions and on future exploration missions beyond the moon. In terms of the effect of gravity during operations on the lunar surface, gravity was at no times found to be a hindrance. The astronauts reported being able to move comfortably and with confidence almost all the time on the surface, except when they occasionally found sinkholes that are filled with dust or when they stumbled inadvertently. But even in cases where they fell down, they were able to recover the upright posture, and at no time was anybody injured or even really distressed by the fall. A few of them even said it was kind of fun to fall because it was a benign environment. And we should remember that the pressurized spacesuit functions like a large airbag, so there's probably very little twisting and those kinds of injuries that are likely to happen inside the spacesuit on the surface of the moon during stumbles and falls, but there will be other issues I'll discuss in a minute. When we're talking about habitation in a pressurized environment, which has enough volume to move around in, and in which the astronauts will not be wearing the large airbag-like pressure suits, then the possibility of injuries, stumbles, falls, twisted ankles, and so forth will increase just because of the absence of the protection of that pressurized suit. All of the effects of lower gravity are being studied in different venues on the Earth. There's a device called the Active Response Gravity Offload System, or ARGOS, here at the Johnson Space Center, which suspends test subjects and astronauts at about 1/6 of their Earth gravity weight, so they can ambulate and do other relevant exercises that will inform planning for lunar surface activities. It's also possible to offload astronauts underwater at the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, not far from Johnson Space Center. So other kinds of dynamic activities can be investigated without the cumbersome suspension system. And this work has been done not only by NASA but by others around the world who are interested in preparing for future lunar expeditions. In particular, the European Space Agency has investigated some aspects of a low-gravity environment underwater in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of France with astronauts dressed in simulated spacesuits doing simulated lunar surface activities. I'll be showing you several of these charts which describe the risks that make up each of the hazards that I've just outlined for you. This chart shows the risk and its short title, and then of interest the final 3 columns on the right, which are subdivided into 2 separate columns indicating in-mission and lifetime risk. So in this particular chart, which relates to the altered gravity fields, we can see that the chart for the first 2 sets of columns is mostly green and yellow. In fact, it's all green and yellow for the mission durations up to about 1 month, and then mission durations up to about 1 year, both of which are assumed to be deep space missions involving lunar orbit and lunar surface activities. These are subject matter assessments, so there are some details yet to be worked out as additional data comes in. But in terms of the factors related to altered gravity in spaceflight, there really isn't expected to be much that we're going to see on moon missions that we have not seen before, with years of shuttle and International Space Station experience and with the prior Apollo missions. Of particular interest will be the ability of the astronauts to do useful work on the lunar surface in terms of their vestibular function, their ability to remain upright and recover from falls, their ability to generate the appropriate workloads with their muscular system, and the ability of their cardiovascular system to maintain the appropriate circulatory function in response to those workloads. There is additional insight to be acquired in each of those areas from extended periods on the moon to allow us greater insights into the effects of fractional gravity on human physiological function. Other aspects of the altered gravity environment are fairly benign to the point of not being a concern at all. We don't expect to have problems with medications or bone fracture and things like that, just because of the low gravity environment, the short period of time the astronauts are exposed to that low gravity environment, and during their most vigorous activities, the protection afforded by the pressure suit. The next of the hazards I want to mention is the radiation environment that fairly permeates space. The space radiation environment can be characterized as galactic cosmic radiation, which can pass through the body very quickly and do minimal damage unless they squarely hit biologically important targets, in which case they can do great damage. And then there's the solar radiation, that is the solar particle events accelerated by coronal mass ejections off the sun in periods of high solar activity relating to solar flares. That radiation can impact the spacecraft in transit and in orbit around the moon. And it also is trapped in Earth's magnetic field, forming the Van Allen radiation belts, which expose astronauts transiting through them to higher radiation doses. The effects of radiation are not limited to cancer, which is a lifetime risk. It's probably not going to be a risk during the spaceflight, but it also relates to soft tissue damage in terms of cataracts and possible atherosclerosis and other organ and tissue damage that can occur with exposure to high radiation doses, and also to its effects on cognition and higher mental function if a particularly severe solar flare occurs when astronauts are poorly protected, either in deep space outside the vehicle or inside of a thin-walled vehicle. The Van Allen belts, the trapped radiation belts around Earth, are a significant risk to astronauts. The Apollo program dealt with that by quickly transiting through the Van Allen belts. Interestingly enough, some of the earliest major mission events occurred while they were transiting that radiation environment, but the astronauts were well protected by not only their spacecraft itself, but by the bulky pressure suits they were still wearing in the immediate post-launch period. So no particular risk from that transit. If one considers the radiation environment of low Earth orbit and of the lunar environment of the moon landing missions, one can see that the radiation environment in low Earth orbit is the lowest of the astronauts' exposures, and the astronauts who went to the moon had increased radiation exposure in terms of their daily dose, which exceeded even the astronauts in the Skylab missions. But interestingly enough, the Skylab astronauts acquired more mission dose than the moon-faring astronauts. So it's a matter of proximity to not only the Van Allen belts, but also to something called the South Atlantic anomaly, which is an offset of the inner Van Allen belt due to an offset of Earth's magnetic field from the geometric center of Earth. In the area of the South Atlantic, that inner radiation belt dips closest to the Earth, and astronauts in high Earth orbits can experience increased radiation exposure every time they pass through that South Atlantic anomaly. But overall, the radiation doses of the astronauts were higher than those they acquired in low Earth orbit, but not a significant clinical concern for their missions, and probably not for our missions of at least the shorter durations. The radiation exposure of Apollo flights did prompt additional attention to radiation concerns on those missions. Specifically, 2 crew members on the first moon landing, Apollo 11, reported seeing light flashes during periods of time when their eyes were closed and the cabin was darkened while they were sleeping on the way back after the moon landing. Their reports were taken seriously by the flight surgeons, and astronauts on subsequent missions also reported seeing light flashes in darkened cabins while they were transiting between the Earth and the moon. This indicated that this was a phenomenon related to galactic cosmic radiation entering the astronauts' heads and stimulating the photosensitive tissue of the retina, generating light flashes. Later Apollo missions carried headgear specifically to look for evidence of those radiation exposures and try to correlate them with astronaut reports of light flashes. They were moderately successful and did seem to show an association between the expected galactic cosmic radiation flux and the incidence of light flashes as reported by the astronauts. In addition to the light flash studies, there were other investigations that were developed and added to the later Apollo missions to try and document the effects of radiation on simple organisms, spores and seeds, and simple tissues, and on even complex organisms like pocket mice. In each case, they were moderately successful in showing the effects of radiation on the simple organisms. But, for example, in the case of the pocket mice that flew on the last Apollo mission, they showed no effects of radiation because of the shielding of the spacecraft environment. So the spacecraft environment was effective in mitigating any effects that might have been documented in those mice. Apollo was lucky in the sense that it dodged every solar flare, every solar particle event of the 1968 through 1972 period. The missions had either just concluded or had yet to start when the notable solar flares occurred. Of particular interest is the August 1972 solar flare, which occurred almost exactly between Apollo 16 and Apollo 17. So in this case, the Apollo program was lucky owing to the short duration of the moon missions. We cannot expect to be that lucky with longer Artemis missions that will be lasting a month or even longer in the next few years. The Apollo astronauts, had they been exposed to the solar flare of the August 72 event, would have been safe inside of their command module with its thicker walls, but had they been inside the thin-walled lunar module or on the lunar surface for an extended period of time, they would have suffered some severe radiation injuries, and it would have been a serious medical event for that mission. So again, Apollo was lucky, and we should make appropriate preparations for future astronauts exposed to a similar environment. If we're talking about the risks of radiation for lunar missions of 1 month or even up to 1 year, you can see by the HRP chart that for most factors they are green or yellow. The red only comes in for lifetime risks for astronauts that venture to Mars. So astronauts going to the moon for short or long periods of time will be monitored carefully to make sure they are not subject to medical problems owing to a large solar flare, but just going to the moon should not be an increased risk for astronauts in terms of even acute radiation effects if they are well shielded and well cared for. Next, I want to talk about the hostile and closed environments of spaceflight. The hostile environment of spaceflight is the external environment of spaceflight, where it can be very cold, minus several hundred degrees, to very hot, plus several hundred degrees, depending on whether one's in the shade of a planet or in the direct sun. The vacuum of space is a very inhospitable element of the environment and can cause almost immediate death or at least dysfunction of astronauts exposed to it. I've already discussed the radiation environment of spaceflight, the galactic cosmic rays, the solar proton events, and the ultraviolet radiation. Space is also filled with highly energetic particles called micrometeoroids, and astronauts on the surface will have to deal with the contamination of the hostile environment that is intrinsic in the lunar dust. But inside the spacecraft, one can expect a more benign and supporting environment. As a reminder, Apollo, like Mercury and Gemini before it, used 100% oxygen at 5 pounds per square inch, approximately 1/3 of an atmosphere, for their missions, which did not exceed 14 days. There was no hypoxia, that is, no shortness of oxygen in the astronauts, no dysbarism, which is the decompression sickness, and no evidence of oxygen toxicity. I should mention that one astronaut did not report any decompression sickness symptoms, but he did write in his autobiography several years later that he had knee pains during both his Gemini and Apollo mission, which were probably related to decompression sickness, a very mild form. So as far as official reporting goes, there is no evidence of decompression sickness in the Apollo program. Subsequent research said that the pure oxygen environment could have been used for up to 30 days, but longer missions such as Skylab's 1 month, 2 month, and 3 month missions used a 70% oxygen, 30% nitrogen environment, again at 5 pounds per square inch, which provided the minimum necessary oxygen for the astronauts. In subsequent space programs, like the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station, the astronauts are at sea level atmosphere, 14.7 pounds per square inch, roughly 20% oxygen, roughly 80% nitrogen. Future exploration missions may use what is called the exploration atmosphere, which is currently being investigated at 34% oxygen, 66% nitrogen, at 8.2 pounds per square inch, both to limit the valuable resource like oxygen and to minimize the risk of decompression sickness. This environment will provide a mildly hypoxic environment equivalent to breathing air at about 4,000 feet altitude, about 1,200 meters altitude. And this is not unprecedented in spaceflight experience. It is very similar to the Space Shuttle cabin environment pre-EVA, which was at about 10.2 pounds per square inch of 26% oxygen. And it's similar to the current International Space Station camp-out protocol. This will enable EVAs, surface EVAs, at suit pressures of about 4.3 pounds per square inch, just like Apollo did, at 100% oxygen, but without the extended denitrogenation pre-breathing period. So it should be able to allow fairly quick and convenient egresses to the lunar surface. Once outside, though, the astronauts will be confronted with a different hazard, and that is the dust of the lunar surface. The dust is composed of small particles of high angularity, which are going to be very good at inserting themselves into the fabric and into the working mechanisms of the spacesuits. As observed by the Apollo astronauts, who often found themselves completely covered by the lunar dust, which they then, of course, brought inside the lunar module when they came in for the evening. So their bodies were often exposed to, if not covered by lunar dust itself, as they handled the pressure suits. There is hope that new technology and new protocols involving suit lock capabilities on future spacecraft will minimize the intrusion of lunar dust, but I won't be surprised if lunar dust is found inside the spacecraft with the risk of biological response to exposure to the dust. In terms of the hostile enclosed environment, you see again that most of the risks in this hazard are yellow, with many of them green as well. The ones specific to injury due to EVA operations are yellow, pending mitigation through design of EVA activities that do not induce injuries. The hypobaric hypoxia, that is the exploration atmosphere, is also yellow with regard to its effects during the flight, but its possible carryover effects during the remainder of the astronaut's lifetime are minimal, and similar for the other aspects of the environment. Isolation confinement will be a concern for these missions as well. Isolation because of the distance from support back on the Earth. The radio communication time of just a few seconds will be noticeable and will serve to emphasize the separation from Earth, and the confinement will be due to the fact that even the most luxurious spacecraft will seem small in the vastness of the moon and in the vastness of outer space. So it's entirely possible that astronauts will feel some degree of confinement and isolation on these missions. Once even inside the spacecraft, one will be sharing space with others and with the environment that one has brought inside the spacecraft, the spacesuits and the life support systems and so forth. So it should not be a surprise if astronauts report being confined and sense isolation, and there should be appropriate countermeasures provided by the medical support organization to minimize the untoward effects of this exposure. We can expect there still to be cognitive and behavioral effects in team performance, function decrements, and sleep loss and circadian misalignment issues. Even on short missions, with appropriate mitigation, they can be minimized, and they should not have very long post-flight impacts. Astronauts, once they get back to Earth, should not have any significant carryover problems. These problems will be much more significant, as shown in this chart, when astronauts go beyond the moon off to planetary distances. And speaking of distances, it's important to remember that the moon seems nearby compared to other planetary goals that have been discussed in the past, but at 250,000 miles away. It takes a good solid 3 days to get there. And if we talk about the near rectilinear halo orbit, it'll take several more days to achieve that orbit. So the transit from the Earth to the duty station around the moon will be on the order of a week or even longer. And then the transit times from the orbit to the surface will be on the order of many hours to days, depending on the orbital geometry. And then just the reverse as they come back into orbit and then depart back from the moon to the Earth. So the distance from the Earth to the moon will be important in terms of the factors that we worry about. That is the appearance of in-flight medical conditions that were not diagnosed pre-flight, the inability to restock medical supplies or food or anything else that may have become spoiled or otherwise rendered unusable during the flight. It just will not be easy to provide fresh supplies or on-the-spot medical care in that environment, and will require the appropriate mitigations in terms of pre-flight planning and so forth to make sure the astronauts are safe during that period of time. The distance from the Earth is reflected in something that I've been told is called the gear ratio. The gear ratio describes how much mass on the launch pad is required to deliver mass to destinations beyond the surface of the Earth. For example, a kilogram in low Earth orbit requires 20 kilograms or so of mass on the launch pad in terms of rocket fuel and structure and other hardware. And then the multipliers when one departs low Earth orbit and heads for the moon, to orbit the moon and to land on the moon, and then to return from the surface of the moon back to lunar orbit and then back to the Earth, culminate in roughly a 400-fold multiplier of every kilogram that it comes back to the Earth. So this speaks in favor of minimizing the mass that is expected to be returned from the surface of the moon back to the Earth, and maximizing the amount of in situ analysis that can be done on the surface to provide the greatest data return with the smallest amount of return mass. Recapping then, there were limited biomedical data collected on the lunar surface during Apollo, mostly limited to monitoring for operational health and safety. That involved analyzing the electrocardiogram for heart rate and cardiac rhythm disturbances and correlating it with activities as observed on live television. The workload and the metabolic factors were assessed from monitoring of suit cooling parameters, and when the data were available from water and beverage ingestion and excretion inside of the EMU, the spacesuit. No new biomedical research is required during short, that is up to 3-day, lunar surface missions on near-side equatorial regions, that is, missions that essentially duplicate what Apollo did. New biomedical research is strongly advised, however, to document the human responses to the lunar environmental factors, including, but not limited to, low gravity, to inform preparations for Mars surface missions, also at lower gravity. New biomedical research may be required during lunar surface missions to novel locations, especially those where astronauts may encounter trapped volatiles potentially harboring biological molecules, and that is the current goal of the Artemis missions, is to go to the south pole of the moon in search of trapped volatiles which may harbor biological molecules. And conceivably, those astronauts may be subject to a post-flight quarantine as the Apollo astronauts were, if it is determined that there are biologically relevant molecules or even species in those trapped volatiles. And new biomedical research may be required during lunar surface missions to any lunar location on missions of significantly longer surface stay times than just 3 days or so of the Apollo missions, in order to assure astronaut health and safety during longer periods of time in the novel environment of the low gravity of the moon. So in summary, Apollo provided a sound biomedical basis for subsequent human space programs. Skylab built on Apollo's foundation to deliver the fundamentals in space biomedical research for the next 2 decades during progressively longer missions. The space shuttle accommodated large crew sizes and modern clinical equipment to permit detailed analysis of the early, that is, just the first 2 weeks of physiological responses to weightlessness and other spaceflight factors. Now on the International Space Station, we're using those techniques and more to document the responses to spaceflight factors on an interplanetary timescale, routinely 6 months, which is just the duration of a transit from the Earth to Mars, and equally importantly, validating the countermeasures needed to keep astronauts safe, healthy, and high-performing during and after that long transit. We learned a lot from the Apollo program in terms of the human response to challenging missions like lunar surface exploration. We can also learn more from the Artemis program of future lunar surface exploration missions. If they are properly planned and properly equipped, we can do the research on those missions to reduce the risks to astronauts on future exploration missions, say to Mars and to other low-gravity destinations in the solar system.